James William Anderson, known to most of us as Jim Anderson, PhD, is a clinical professor in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Science at Northwestern University and former president of Chicago Psychoanalytic Society. He is the editor of the Annual of Psychoanalysis, member of the editorial board of Clio's Psyche, and he sits on the leadership team of Clio's Psyche and the Psychohistory Forum. A specialist in psychobiography, he has published papers on William and Henry James, Abraham Lincoln, Edith Wharton, Sigmund Freud, Winnicott, Wilson, and Frank Lloyd Wright. Jim, who also has a considerable psychoanalytic practice, has a book in press with Oxford University Press entitled Psychobiography, In Search of the Inner Life. He attempts in the book to explore both what can be wrong in looking at life through psychobiographical lens, and what can enable an author to write a high-quality psychobiography. In his talk, he looks at one of the areas that can either undermine a psychobiography or that can be the key to a sound psychobiography. That is, that area is a relationship that the author has with the person whom the author is writing about. His talk is entitled Animosity, Affection, Agony, and Empathy, Elements in Psychobiographers' Relationship with the People They Study. Jim, look forward to what you have to say. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Paul, and thank you for inviting me to this conference. I've enjoyed a number of the sessions I've attended. I'd like to ask I'd like to thank those of you who have your video on, and I'd like to ask as many others as possible if you would put your video on. It helps me a great deal when I'm talking, if I can see some of the people I'm talking to. For example, if I see a lot of people nod off and go to sleep, I figure, okay, I've got to watch about what I'm saying to wake people up a little bit. I claim that every psychobiographer has an intense, intimate, absorbing relationship with the person being written about. How can such a relationship not develop? First, the author has to be attracted to write about that particular person. Then the author spends months or years being immersed in the subject's life. Nothing is more likely to ruin a psychobiography than the psychobiographer's relationship with the subject. Psychobiographers who hate their subjects are likely to do a hatchet job to try to obliterate the hapless subject. The situation is no better when psychobiographers love their subjects. Then they are almost sure to create an idealized portrait that bears little similarity to what a human being who has strengths and weaknesses and complexities is like. I'll start with an initial example. Sigmund Freud was the first to recognize the danger of using psychobiography to attack the subject. As he put it, a psychobiography can, quote, blacken the radiant and drag the sublime into the dust, unquote. More than 20 years after he made that remark, Freud undertook with his co-author, American diplomat William Bullitt, to write a psychobiography of the American president, Woodrow Wilson. In the introduction to this book, Freud revealed that Wilson was, quote, from the beginning, unsympathetic to me. And this aversion increased in the course of years, the more I learned about him, unquote. Freud claimed that he later developed some sympathy for Wilson, but it was, quote, sympathy of a special sort mixed with pity, unquote. What is this pity? He explained it stemmed from comparing the strength of the man to the greatness of the task which he had taken upon himself. What Freud meant is that he had seen Wilson as being far too feeble to accomplish his purpose of bringing about a just peace overseen by the League of Nations after the Great War. Freud's so-called pity for Wilson drips with contempt. To Freud, Wilson was a pathetic weakling who had fantasies about himself that he couldn't possibly fulfill. Not surprisingly, the resulting book is a travesty of what a psychobiography should be. Now, in a way, the existence of this book on Wilson was a boon for me. As Paul mentioned, I've recently written a book that's in press about psychobiography, and having this book by Freud, or co-authored by Freud, enabling me in my own book to have examples of much of what could go wrong in psychobiography. Freud and Bullett's book is an attack on Wilson that willy-nilly hurls psychoanalytic interpretations, especially denigrating ones at poor Wilson. For example, assuming that Wilson, as a supposed weakling, would lack manly, powerful sexuality, they claimed, despite evidence to the contrary that was available to them, that Wilson had an insipid, tame sex life because of his supposed sexual conflicts. In fact, Wilson was highly sexualized. He may have been the most highly sexualized president ever, although there was also Warren Harding, who famously had multiple trysts with one of his sexual partners in a closet in the White House as a Secret Service agent stood outside the door guarding him. I suppose we have to consider Bill Clinton as also being in the competition for the randiest US president. Back to Wilson. During his marriage, he had a passionate affair with another woman. His letters to his second wife before their marriage are the raciest and earthiest letters known to have been written by an American president. So Freud had this assumption based on his negative feeling about Wilson, attacked him, and he was quite wrong. The book on Wilson is so abysmal that when it was published in 1966, long after it was completed, the psychoanalytic establishment was aghast. Anna Freud recruited Erik Erikson, a psychoanalyst admired by the general public, to do something. Erikson came up with a strategy. He wrote a review in which he claimed that Freud had had the smallest hand in the book, except for writing the wise introduction, and that the book was almost completely the work of the co-author Bullitt. Here, by the way, we have another example of idealization. Idealization, much like hatred, can blind a person. And due to Erikson's admiration of Freud, Erikson probably believed what he said about the book. But in later years, documents were discovered showing that Sigmund Freud indeed had been the primary author and had signed on to all of the book's contents. If Anna Freud and Erikson had been alive at that time, they would have had egg on their faces. Now, I myself wrote a paper that's relevant to this discussion about the relationship of the author with the subject. I wrote a paper on Frank Lloyd Wright. Like millions of people, I'm enchanted with his architecture, but I came to dislike Wright the man. He was the kind of person who could never admit he was wrong. It is now well known that his buildings had all kinds of structural defects. He built a house for his cousin, Richard Lloyd Jones, and there were leaks that happened in many of Wright's buildings. An angry Jones called up Wright and complained, "Damn it, Frank, it's leaking on my desk." Wright replied, saying something to the effect of, "Well, then just move your damn desk, you fool." Wright was also arrogant. Once, while testifying in court, Wright referred to himself as the world's greatest architect. Asked later how he could make such an extravagant claim, he replied, "Well, I was under oath, wasn't I?" Of course, I included those examples because I think they're funny. But there's a lot about Wright that is much worse. He cheated on his first wife and on various girlfriends. He often lied. He took advantage of clients. He borrowed money and claimed that he had collateral that they didn't have. His anti-Semitism especially offended me. So after I wrote that paper, I was encouraged to write a book on Wright. And since there's so much interest in him, I almost surely could have found a publisher. But I finally conclude I couldn't really stand spending so much time with him, so I decided not to write that book. So in my case, I declined to write a book on Wright. Wright was unlikable, but it would be far harder to do a psychobiography on someone who is truly despicable, much worse than Wright, and who in history has been more abhorrent than Adolf Hitler. Yet historian Robert Waite wrote an excellent psychobiography of him. How did Robert Waite do this? I know something about how Waite did this because I had the experience of getting to know him well when I was a young assistant professor at Williams College in Massachusetts, where he was a professor, and because he also wrote a memoir about his life and included especially about his experience of working on Hitler. Now, the first secret of how Waite did this, is that he saw Hitler as providing a fascinating puzzle, an intellectual challenge. Waite asked himself, how could the German people hail as their savior this peculiar little man, this mentally flawed failure? Waite notes that one reason Hitler is so intriguing is because of, quote, the profound, almost magnetic horror associated with his name. He quotes Joseph Conrad, who searches into evil in the heart of darkness and finds himself confronted with, quote, the fascination of the abomination. In other words, people are curious and fascinated with evil. Waite also loved to tell stories, and studying Hitler gave him an opportunity to tell stories about someone about whom people have endless curiosity. Now, I'll give an example of one of Waite's stories. Now, this is a story I heard him tell when I knew him. Now, it has nothing to do with Hitler, but I'm going to give this example partly because I like to tell the story that Waite tells, and partly because it illustrates something about what he was like in his style of storytelling. Okay, so this is a story about historian Robert Waite. During World War II, Robert Waite served in the army in Minneapolis, thousands of miles from any fighting. He received what's called a Good Conduct Medal, an award that meant virtually nothing. It was presented to any soldier who stayed out of serious trouble for a year. Thousands and thousands of soldiers received this medal. It makes me wonder, my father was in the army in World War II. I wonder if he ever got that medal. I don't really know. My father was equally safe working in the Pentagon. Yes, I could tell a story about my father, but that would get off the subject. My father spent World War II working in the Pentagon. Anyway, Waite and a friend of his had the idea of putting this medal into a fancy setting so that it looked like a medal that really meant something. It was a kind of pathetic little round medal that you wore with connected to a ribbon. Years later, Waite was at a reception in Germany with a number of dignitaries. A German who was wearing a fancy ribbon across his chest noticed Waite's impressive-looking medal. Remember, he had it put in a special setting, so it looked really like something meaningful. This man asked Waite about the medal. Waite replied with these words, "It's nothing. I'd rather not talk about it," and walked away, affecting a slight limp. And then he overheard the German remarking in German to a colleague, "What modesty." So far, I have said that Waite managed to write about Hitler because he was able to distance himself from the German dictator. Waite viewed Hitler as an intellectual puzzle and someone about whom he could tell stories. But there was another element. All those years ago, when I was an assistant professor at Williams College, Bob Waite and I taught a seminar together on the topic of psychoanalysis and historical biography. I was so fortunate. I am an inveterate saver and have my notes from that seminar. Let me warn you, if you give a talk at this conference, I might be sitting there taking notes, and I might quote something in the future that you've said, so you better watch out what you say. Anyway, I consulted my notes from a lecture Waite gave in the seminar about his work on Hitler. The lecture had the same tone as did his memoir. It described what a great adventure it had been to study Hitler. Yet he also commented the following, and this is what I want to emphasize. He wrote, "Hitler is in us all. Hitler was a human phenomenon." Now, my conclusion is that Bob Waite had some awareness in himself that a part of him was like Hitler. In Waite's story about leading someone to believe that he had been a war hero, Waite was acting something like Hitler, although of course in a harmless way. All of us have a darker side that contains elements similar to that of a destructive person. We have to be able to draw on that to understand an evildoer like Hitler. We can't have a complete othering. We can't say, oh, I'm just perfect. There's nothing wrong with me. And I completely distinguish myself from this monster who has nothing to do with me, who is nothing but evil and destructive. Now, I was unable to do that with Frank Lloyd Wright. And I think that was the deeper reason why I shunned writing a book about him. I could have the capacity to lie or cheat or brag as Wright did, or at least to desire to do those things. Ultimately, the reason why I avoided getting closer to Wright is that I didn't want to face those elements in myself. Now, if dislike of a subject is troublesome, idealization is equally dangerous. And so I want to give one example of idealization. Consider the psychobiography of Saint Ignatius, written by W. Meissner, S.J. Even before I read this book, I concluded that it would likely be problematical. Why did I come to this assumption so quickly? Well, Meissner was a Catholic priest and a deep believer. I doubted that Meissner could look objectively at a man he considered to be a saint. And Ignatius was not just a saint, but he was the revered founder of the Jesuits, the very order to which Meissner belonged. To Meissner's credit, he does provide some insightful analytic insights into Ignatius, the man. But ultimately, Meissner is held back by his reverence. For example, Ignatius had many visions of the Virgin Mary and Jesus. Many psychologists might ask why Ignatius created these particular visions. Did they have something to do with his own mother? Or maybe feeling alone? Or maybe he wanted to feel special and fantasized Mary and Jesus choosing to appear to him. But Meissner was closed off from exploring any questions like these. His conclusion is simply that the visions, quote, bear eloquent testimony to Ignatius's inner spiritual life, unquote. In other words, it's just that the visions were real. You can't analyze them. Jesus and Mary appeared to him. So how can we analyze them and think they had anything to do with Meissner's own personal makeup or his unconscious or anything like that? Now, I've made two large claims so far. First, that all psychobiographers have intense relationships with their subjects. And second, that such a relationship can undermine the psychobiography. Does that mean that, as the caustic critics of psychobiography claim, that this kind of study is destined to be fatally flawed? Of course, you know that's not my view. And I now come to my third claim, which I already hinted at or implied so far. My third claim is that the relationship of the author with the subject is the key to the highest quality psychobiographies. What do I mean by this? Simply that psychobiographers must use rather than be used by their relationship with their subjects. Of course, all of you who are clinicians, I see Susan there as a member of the audience, well know how clinicians use their countertransference as one of the keys to their successful treatment of their patients. So I'm making a parallel here to the work of psychobiographers with the people they write about. Thank you for nodding, Susan. See, I do like to be able to see some people as I'm speaking. It is the relationship that gives the psychobiographer insight into the subject. Any author who tries to maintain an objective, uninvolved, sterile distance with the subject is lost. Instead, as master biographer Leon Adel wrote, one must identify to some extent with the subject. How else can the author re-experience the subject's feelings, problems, and struggle? Adel concluded, we must try to measure the world through the subject's eyes and to penetrate into that world. Now it's time for my next example. I'm well along. I promise you, I'll leave plenty of time for discussions and questions and so on. My next example is the study by psychologist Margot Beth Duxler of diarist and short story writer Anais Nin. Tried to find out how to pronounce her name correctly, and I'm fairly close. Anais Nin.
Anais Nin.
I think it's Nin. According to the internet, it's pronounced more like Nin and not Nin. I could be wrong, but that's what I got. I spent a good half hour trying to get it right. Anyway, I'm going to call her Nin. Duxler had been Duxler had what could be either a great advantage or an insuperable obstacle, that she knew Nin. Duxler was an intelligent but impressionable and rather naive 20-year-old in 1968 when she became entranced with a volume of Nin's published diary. Nin was a beautiful, seductive, deep-thinking woman who wrote a series of novels and short stories that got published but never quite won an audience. The early published versions of her diaries, though, which tell of her seemingly liberated lifestyle, sold well and created a sensation, just as the wave of feminism was washing over the United States and Western Europe. Nin had had affairs with multiple people, including the novelist Henry Miller and the psychoanalyst Otto Rank. A junior college student at the time, Duxler felt in need of someone she could idealize. Her mother, she felt, was conservative, severely critical about premarital sex, and negative about anything outside the realm of the family's narrow suburban existence. Reading Nin's diary, Duxler felt, quote, transfixed, hopeful, with a sense of recognition in the fragile beginnings of a realization that I might be able to create a life for myself, as Anais had done for herself. Duxler managed to meet Nin and had a friendship with her that included regular correspondence and many meetings over the course of 11 years until Nin's death in 1979. After Nin's death, Duxler, who idealized Nin, became painfully disillusioned. Some volumes of Nin's original diaries were published. It became known that Nin had edited and to some extent fictionalized her original diaries when publishing those altered versions during her lifetime. Duxler learned how drastically Neen had misportrayed her life in the altered versions that Duxler had read earlier. For example, Neen made herself seem much more independent than she had been by concealing that she'd been married and supported by her husband. None of that was mentioned in the original published diaries. And she also hid the extent of her lying to people. Duxler realized that Neen had lied to her too. In particular, Neen had told Duxler how important Duxler was to her. Here is an example. In the originally published version of the diary, Neen had written that a great trauma she underwent was a miscarriage she suffered well into a pregnancy. Neen had made a dramatic statement to Duxler that she felt that the soul of her miscarried child had been reborn in this younger woman, Duxler. Well, Duxler learned, first of all, that Neen had not had a miscarriage, but instead had had a 7th-month abortion. Furthermore, Duxler hadn't really been so important to Neen. Neen had told a number of other women, not just Duxler, that she perceived them to be the incarnation of her miscarried child. Duxler had become a clinical psychologist by the time she undertook to write a psychobiography of Aeneas Neen. Duxler skillfully used her feelings about Neen to understand Neen psychologically. Relying on her own feelings towards Neen, Duxler had insights into how others in Neen's life had reactions like Duxler's, such as loving and idealizing Neen, accepting Neen's warmth and vitality, while also feeling used and betrayed. But Duxler by no means does a hatchet job on Neen. Duxler, through studying Neen's life, develops an empathic understanding of how Neen became the person she was. Duxler delves into Neen's troubled childhood, which included her mother's weakness and depression, and her father's sexual abuse of her and later abandonment of her. Duxler came to see and explains to the reader how Neen's personality resulted from her attempts to find a workable self after the trauma she had experienced. A key theme in Neen's life is that she felt unworthy of anyone's love and constantly feared abandonment, and hence using her beauty and charm, she constantly seduced people emotionally and often sexually. And hence, the title of the book that finally resulted is Seduction, a Portrait of Aeneas Nin. Now, a central ingredient of a sound psychobiographer is the author's deep knowledge of oneself and one's relationship with the subject. And Duxler is somebody who accomplished that. Perhaps the most widely acclaimed psychobiography ever is Erik Erikson's study of Mohandas Gandhi, who is widely called the Mahatma, meaning great soul. The volume won both the National Book Award and the Pulitzer Prize. Wouldn't it be great to have other psychobiographers that are so highly regarded? We might assume that it would have been easy for Erikson, a brilliant psychoanalyst who had a profound understanding of himself, to write a successful study of Gandhi, but it was not easy for him at all. In fact, about halfway through writing the book, Erikson found himself with crippling writer's block. I know Erikson was stuck and might have given up on his book. I know Carol Gilligan, who knew Erikson well at the time, and told me about what a difficult time this was for Erikson, who was really in some agony over being unable to go on with writing this book that he had devoted so much time to and had spent considerable time in India. But anyway, Erikson at this point, looked boldly into his feelings about Gandhi. He then took the unusual step of writing Gandhi a letter, notwithstanding that Gandhi, of course, had been dead for more than 20 years. Erikson realized that he had started out with an idealization of Gandhi, and indeed there was much to appreciate about Gandhi. Gandhi not only led India's revolution against British colonial rule, but he did so while emphasizing nonviolent resistance. Yet, as he was writing, Erikson found himself becoming increasingly disillusioned with Gandhi. Erikson was troubled by seeing how Gandhi mistreated both his wife and his son. But one incident in particular especially bothered Erikson. At his ashram, at Gandhi's ashram, the older boys and girls went to bathe together in a nearby stream. This was a regular practice there. Gandhi learned that some boys had teased two of the girls. Gandhi was appalled by the sexuality that he saw as being involved in this. What did he do? He arranged so that all the girls would cut short their lovely hair, their lovely long hair, so they wouldn't be so tempting to the boys. It was as if the girls were being punished. Erikson saw how wrong Gandhi's action was, and this really bothered him, and how out of touch Gandhi was with his own motivations here. But ultimately, Erikson's study was immensely enriched by this period as Erikson came to see that Gandhi wasn't only the celebrated Mahatma. He was also a complex human being who had strengths and weaknesses, excellences and frailties, as do all human beings. Erikson's letter enabled him to leave behind his unrealistic idealization and to delve into the real story. How does an imperfect human being accomplish great achievements? I'm to my last example, so we're getting near the end. My final example has a lot in common with the Erikson example. I will look at Jean Strauss's psychobiography of Alice James. Alice James was the sister of two of the greatest American writers, William James and Henry James. Though piercingly intelligent like her famous brothers, as can be seen from her insightful letters and diary entries that were retained after her death, Alice James never accomplished much of anything. Hobbled by her psychological problems, she spent most of her life as an invalid. Strauss, who is not a psychologist, but certainly is knowledgeable about psychology, set out to learn about Alice James's life. One reason I'm talking about Strauss is that she provided a detailed account of her journey. Noting that she herself grew up with brothers, Strauss explained that she was drawn to writing about a woman who, as the only daughter, belonged to such a sparkling, stimulating family. Much like Erikson's experience with Gandhi, Strauss became stuck in the course of writing her book. Alice James irritated her. Strauss was bothered that Alice James rarely devoted her fine mind to anything useful and frequently pushed people away. James had rendered herself, as Strauss saw it, literally invalid. While taking time off from her writing, Strauss gained a new insight into James. Strauss saw in effect that her own frustration that James did not do or accomplish more reflected James's own disappointment with herself. Strauss commented, quote, "Her fierce competitiveness, her ambition in that family to be more than just a girl, an invalid, a waste, a failure, that measured the degree of her incapacity," unquote. Strauss realized that her reaction of disappointment with James gave her insight into James's own disappointment with herself. On a visit to James's grave, chance to really think about her feelings, Strauss noted, quote, "I was quite astonished to find myself suddenly in tears," unquote. It occurred to Strauss that most likely no one had been at the grave in years. Strauss found herself saying to James, "Don't worry, I'll take care of you." Then she thought, I realized in a rush that she had worked her powerful will on me, just like she did with people who lived with her. There I was after 100 years taking care of Alice James, unquote. Her reaction to James gave her insight into how the people around James had reacted to her. Here we have another example of how a psychobiographer's feelings about her subject can teach her how people reacted to that person in her lifetime. Now I come to my conclusion. Jacques Barzun, possibly the harshest and most acerbic critic of psychohistory and psychobiography, leveled the following attack. He wrote, psychohistorians see others moved by unconscious forces that distort vision and compel strange behavior, but they assume themselves to be clear transmitters of light and judgment. Why is their vision of persons and events not blurred and skewed as well, and their interpretations forced upon them by dark needs rather than evidential reasons? In other words, he pointed out that psychobiographers are moved by unconscious forces just as psychobiographers claim their subjects to be. He probably imagined that that statement obliterated psychobiography and showed its worthlessness. But instead, this view both explains why many studies go wrong and offers a direction for writing high-quality psychobiography. My way of putting it is that indeed the people studied by psychobiographers have multi-layered inner worlds. All authors also have their own complicated inner lives. They have biases, likes and dislikes, internal conflicts, and a whole accumulation of experiences that have influenced them. A psychobiographical subject is never a robot, but always a flesh and blood living person. A psychobiographer, similarly, is never a machine or a camera, but always a person with all that that means about each individual having a unique and complex makeup. Psychobiography consists of a human being studying another human being. Nothing is more crucial for psychobiographers than to be in touch with their own inner worlds and to have insight into the intricacies of the relationships they have with their subjects. Then psychobiographers are in the position not to be defeated and sidetracked by their feelings about their subjects, but instead to use those feelings as the pathway for developing deep insight into the psyches of the people they are writing about. Thank you. Okay, so I think it's time for questions and comments. I don't know whether I should conduct this portion or somebody else will step forward.
Ina, are you there?
Well, we go to the chat box. You can put your questions or your name in the chat box, and we'll mostly follow that order. Some people like putting up the thumb, which you can literally do, and I see David has a thumb up, but the problem with that is we don't always see the artificial as well as the physical thumb. So now we have both from David Lotto. So David, why don't you go, and then I will, and and Ina will keep an eye on the chat box.
Okay. I'm unmuted. Good. Jim, thank you. That was wonderful. I have been concerned with this matter of psychohistorians writing about subjects which they are involved with. I've written several papers about this, not about psychobiography, but about psychohistory, where the author is writing about a group which he or she either identifies with strongly or has strong negative feelings. I mean, much of what you say about psychobiography applies to this as well. I wrote a detailed paper about Vamik Vulcan and some of his work, and how I feel that his being Turkish definitely gives him a bias in writing about events that involve Turkish history. Several other examples: Gerald Post, who's no longer with us, but has written many articles, is an expert on terrorism and writes about the pathology of terrorists and their organizations. Gerald Post is a consultant and on the payroll of the CIA. And I argue that his views about terrorism are very much influenced by his idealization of being an American. Right, so I just wanted to say that and see what your responses might be.
Yeah, wonderful examples. That makes every bit of sense. And the same thing that I've talked about comes into play, that if these authors could really look into themselves and understand themselves, there could be some benefit coming from their close association with what they write about, but at times maybe they're overcome. So it happens, I was just telling somebody, a Turkish person I know, that Vulcan co-authored the psychobiography of Ataturk, the founder of modern Turkey, and the authors had a vast idealization of Ataturk, which I think could have interfered with that book.
John Mack wrote an introduction to Vamik's book, in which he has a beautiful paragraph describing the double-edged dilemma and how it's a double-edged thing. If you're identified with, in some strong way, the group that you write about, you have insight and experience that makes your contributions valuable, but at the same time, you can be biased. So it's a dilemma that Mack describes very elegantly.
And I summarize that with my comment about using rather than being used by your relationship with the person you're writing about or the people you're writing about. Easier said than done, though.
Mike and others, why don't you put your name, at least, or question in the chat box, so that we can follow along in a more orderly fashion, since we don't always see that hand up. I put my request in there. Robert Waite was someone who I didn't know personally, but I wish I had, though we corresponded, especially when I worked to encourage him to have the Psychopathic God reprinted. That is his book on Hitler. Because I used it, I don't know, over 30 years in my course on Hitler and the Holocaust, and found it valuable, but always with a great deal of frustration. I always described it as a shopping cart full of different psychoanalytic theories that were undifferentiated. He went down the aisles and threw everything in there. So my question is, was that real feelings? Did he so idealize anyone who had a psychoanalytic training, especially MDs, that he would treat things that were quite weak, along with work that represented enormous scholarship, and treat them equally. He collected facts and just threw them together. Can you tell me, based upon having worked with him, if this is the case, if he really differentiated?
Well, let's see. I don't, there's not a lot I can say from so many years ago. The only thing relevant that I can think of is that he spoke about Erikson in an idealized way, and that he had gotten to know Erikson because Erikson was at Austin Riggs, and Waite was at Williams College in Williamstown, and they're about half-hour drive between the two. And so he spent some time at Austin Riggs and got to know Erikson. So I can remember feeling he kind of idealized Erikson. Now, of course, I did too at the time. So I don't know that there was any contrast between how he felt and I felt, but that might help support your idea that he had some idealization that may have affected that book, idealization of psychoanalysts and psychiatrists. You obviously read the book very carefully, and you have a lot of opinions about it. So that makes sense to me that this would be a valid critique of that book.
I would suggest that a lot of that idealization had to do with his inability to teach. Either in his first year or after his first year at Williams, he became very troubled and had what I think he called a breakdown. It's a lot of times since I read it. And the president, and he went to resign from his position, and the president of the college instead said, well, here, you have a sabbatical and work on your own psychological well-being. And he came away from that with that incredible idealization. And it was a wonderful thing that the president did that, since he was a very productive person who had to reconcile having been a preacher's son born in, I think it was rural Canada, and raised there, and then having to reconcile different impulses that he had. Did he speak at all about this?
He never talked to me about that experience, but like you, I read his memoir, so I do know about those early experiences of his. But the one thing I can say is that he recovered from that. Obviously, his self-esteem was somewhat weak at the time, at that early time when he first became an assistant professor. And he went on to become a highly revered professor there. He was a great lecturer and kind of one of the great stars of the university that people knew about, and people who weren't taking his classes would come to some of his lectures just to hear how he would tell his stories and talk about German history.
Oh, thank you. Ina, you want to handle the chat box, or should I?
Yeah, so Mike O'Brien is next.
Thank you. So I just wanted to thank you very much, Jim. I always love your presentations and learn a lot from them. And with this question that you're addressing of the subjectivity of the writer versus his subject, I was in a bind with writing about Freud some time ago, and I was very critical of him, and I was very critical of the psychoanalyst who was presenting. And then I gave myself a little lecture that I wouldn't treat a client this way. I saw myself as a person-centered therapist, tried to be. And I just realized that my role with this criticizing these two characters was they shouldn't be pleasing me. I should be looking at them with unconditional positive regard and keeping my stuff, my life, my issues, my concerns separate to do the study. And then at the end, I could, in a discussion section, add in my subjective concerns. But I think that Carl Rogers, with his clear emphasis on separating yourself and having unconditional positive regard for the client, helps with this issue of self-awareness and separation.
I'm glad you bring up Rogers. You know, I'm a psychoanalyst and former president of the Chicago Psychoanalytic Society, but I have a great regard for Rogers. I think he's really doesn't get the attention that he's due, and was a brilliant psychotherapist from whom I learned a great deal. I mean, from his writings. And what you're saying isn't far off from my approach. I mean, my approach is that the key is having empathy towards the person you're writing about. And empathy means trying to understand them from, you know, as if you were standing in their shoes, and picturing how, if that person did such and such a thing, you might well have done the same thing, or at least desired to do so, if you'd gone through the experiences that person went through. So I do think that that basic empathy and sympathy for the subject is one of the keys to doing psychobiography. But then, as I think you also said, you kind of have to step back too and have some judgment. I could see why Frank Lloyd Wright acted the way he did. For example, he thought he was so brilliant that he ought to be able to make these buildings the way he wanted. And if it meant a certain amount of lying and cheating to be able to get the money to do so, and so on and so forth, he was going to do it. So I could picture being in his shoes and feeling that way. And there was a certain truth to what he did, in the fact that he was incredibly brilliant as an architect. And many of those buildings wouldn't have gotten built if he hadn't done it that way. But at the same time, you can sit back and say, well, wait a second, though. I mean, there's a lot that we want to be critical of. We don't want to support people lying and cheating in that way, telling untruths to their clients, not taking their clients' needs into account. So there is some combination of a basic empathy and perhaps even unconditional positive regard, as you put it, but also being able to step back and have some judgment.
Thanks.
I think we're up to Hans now.
Yes, hi. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, my name is Hans Bakker, Hans Baker for people who don't speak Dutch. I just wanted to make a little comment about Gandhi's Truth. The book influenced me. I have it right here. I cited it in my own little book, Toward a Just Civilization, which I wrote after the time that I had been in India for a year, working with the Gandhi Peace Foundation. And studying the Gandhian movement and talking to Gandhians. So I interviewed many Gandhians, and in my little book, I described visits to 5 of the more than 20 ashrams that we spent time in. And it was very helpful to me in writing my own little book to read what Erikson said and to pay attention to the personal word that was referred to earlier. And Gandhi's humility about anybody who might be writing about him and his own mistakes and errors. I'm not so sure that cutting off the hair of the young girls in the context of India at that time was such a horrible thing. It's not exactly like teenage girls in Texas or anything, but that's debatable. Now, I was at the Judge Baker Children's Center for a year on my sabbatical. That's part of Harvard Medical School. It's in the Longwood area. Some of you may have known about it. And after I'd been there for 6 months, I learned that the desk and office that I was using had been the office that had been used by Erik Erikson when he was trying to establish his own reputation, and he was having great difficulty being recognized initially. So it felt like an immense gift that Stuart Hauser had given me by allowing me to use that room. That building is now gone. Those of you who have visited Boston in the last few years will know that There have been tremendous changes that have taken place in the Longwood area. They construct huge buildings, but they don't pay any attention to parking. I believe that one of the things that needs to be said about Gandhi and the Gandhian movement is that we need to have some awareness of Indic civilization and Gandhi's balancing act between a whole bunch of different religions. Gujarat in India is known as one of the friendliest states in India. I think Kerala is in competition with Gujarat, but it's a place where it's been an entrepot for thousands of years. So there's so many different cultural factors. And it was a great boon to me to learn about the history of Kathiawad. His father was a kind of a little petty prime minister, premier in Kathiawad. And I think the psychohistory of Gandhi needs to have a socio-historical component. This is my theme for my own talk later on. Sometimes some psychohistorians and some psycho analysts will sometimes forget about the enormous differences in different civilizations. I've been rereading Samuel.
Thank you, Hans.
Yes.
We're almost out of time, so I think we need to give Jim a chance
So
to respond.
I'm sorry, I went on a little too long. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Well, I wish I could hear more. And if you're going to, did you say you're going to speak later? I'll certainly attend. Yes, it sounds like you really learned a lot about Erikson and Gandhi. And the point you were getting to is how important understanding the different culture is.
Yeah.
And I have one of the chapters in my book on that topic, and it obviously matters for everybody, but especially somebody like writing about an American, or I guess I'll call him an Erikson American, writing about somebody in India. I will note that he made a real attempt to try to understand Indian culture. And he had one great advantage, that he met a young man named Sudhir Kakar, who was his guide to understanding India and how Indian psychology is different from American. And Kakar went on to be, one of the foremost, be a psychoanalyst and one of the foremost expositors and analysts of the psychology of India. So that was an advantage Erikson had, but without a doubt, there would be limitations to how well he could understand India.
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you. Let's hear Paul's comment now, and then if time permits, I'll ask my question. Paul writes, Jim, you have done so much wonderful psychobiography through so many years. Why is it that you are only now publishing a full psychobiography?
Well, why am I only writing the book now? Oh gosh, I don't know. I wrote papers all along, and I finally decided, I guess it's time to write a book. And it really was a chance to, I wrote something like 5 papers over the years, essentially on how to do psychobiography, the problems in writing psychobiography. So it's a chance to put together and extend those ideas. So why not sooner? I can't say anything more about that, but I'm glad I finally got to it.
Thank you.
I am too.
Thank you. So we have time for, I think, just one more question, but it has to be brief, and the response will have to be brief. I had myself in the chat box, so let me ask it. I want to sort of comment on this idea of bias, right? So if there's somebody has a strong emotional connection to the subject matter, of course, if it's positive or negative, it can be construed as bias. But the positive part of it is it's also a connection, right? And apparently you didn't have enough of a connection to Frank Lloyd Wright to want to work through all that stuff, right? I just want to say, though, in connection with the biography, where there's a negative valence to this, that's especially where the Verstehen comes in, right? Or the empathy. And I want to take 2 examples of this and just mention them briefly, and that is Lifton's The Nazi Doctor. To me, this is sort of like a model of how someone who could have a very strong bias toward a subject, by working it through and this is a model of how the self-correction of the emotional connection to the subject matter can result in a real masterpiece. And the other one was Alice Miller in her psychobiography of Hitler and For Your Own Good. And that sheds light on this idea how, you mentioned this other biography about how everyone has an inner Hitler. Well, she really nails what that is, this empathizing with the inner child of this monster. And how he got to be such a monster. I mean, he was severely beaten practically every day of his life by his father. That really illuminates this. And anyone who's experienced corporal punishment can certainly relate to that. I'll stop there. Yeah.
I think that's a brilliant comment. I can't add anything more to it. Maybe I should be writing about Alice Miller instead of about Waite.
Thank you. Yeah. I think we're out of time. But thank you very much. This was an incredibly stimulating presentation. Thank you.
Well, the terrific questions and comments. I really learned a lot from them. Thank you so much. I'm going to laugh too.
Okay, thank you. So we have a 5-minute break, and then at 11:10, we resume now with 3 concurrent sessions. In this room, we're going to have Claude Barbray. Padma Desai is going to be in room 2, and we have When Worlds Collide, a panel in room 3. That's with Rose Gupta and et al. Thank you.
I apologize for not being more active earlier, but I just had cataract surgery.
Hans, I'm glad to see that you're able to
Yes,
jump in now at this point.
I was told not to see any video for a week, but nevertheless, I'm going to do my best here because I'm very much interested in everything. And I thought the talk was great. And James Anderson, Jim, was very humble. I thought he deserves a good conduct medal. Are you still there, James?
Oh, I'm here. Yes.
Yeah, I was joking. I said you deserve a good conduct medal.
Well, that's not much. I'd rather get better than that. The good conduct medal meant almost nothing.
I'm joking, of course, and I appreciate your humility. You seemed very humble about writing your book and so forth.
Well, that's nice to say that, but I don't think that's really my personality. I am somebody who tends to feel pride. I hope justifiable pride when I do something well.
Yes, that precisely the way you framed it indicates to me that you're a humble person. You're not Frank Lloyd Wright and arrogant about your abilities. I'm sure you have many great abilities, but the way you phrased it and everything, you're not like I've written 30 books in the last 20 years, so that kind of guy.
I have ability to act properly in social situations, but that may still mean that a lot of some pride is underlying that.
Well, I'll have to get to know you better then.